secretario ejecutivo de la CEPAL, señor José Manuel Salazar Ceriñaje. Gracias.
Muchas gracias, Daniel. Bienvenidos y bienvenidas todas a la CEPAL y a este 36º Seminario Regional de Política Fiscal. Un saludo muy especial a la estimada Laura Oroz, directora de Cooperación con América Latina y el Caribe de la Agencia Española de Cooperación Internacional para el Desarrollo, a todas las estimadas y estimados ministros, viceministras, viceministros y autoridades hacendarias de los países de América Latina y el Caribe, estimados representantes de organismos internacionales, bancos de desarrollo, especialistas de la academia y la sociedad civil, colegas de la CEPAL y del Sistema de Naciones Unidas en Chile. Empiezo por agradecer de manera muy especial a la cooperación española, en la persona de Laura Oroz, por su apoyo y colaboración continua, y ya de años, con la CEPAL, incluyendo en particular con este importante Seminario Regional de Política Fiscal. Agradezco también a las autoridades de los países de América Latina y el Caribe que han contribuido a que este seminario se consolide como un referente regional para la discusión sobre la actualidad económica y fiscal de nuestros países. Este tradicional encuentro tiene ya 36 años de celebrarse ininterrumpidamente todos los años. Tal vez creo que se celebró en el año pandémico del 2020. Virtual, ininterrumpidamente todos los años. A lo largo de este periodo ha servido como foro de diálogo entre autoridades nacionales, funcionarios de organismos internacionales, especialistas fiscales y organizaciones de la sociedad civil sobre los retos de la política fiscal. Es un evento producto del trabajo en equipo entre la CEPAL, los países miembros y nuestros aliados y socios en organismos internacionales, academia, centros de pensamiento y sociedad civil. El entorno macrofinanciero actual, caracterizado por un crecimiento económico bajo y altos costos financieros, ha vuelto más complejo el manejo de la política fiscal en la región, como ustedes bien lo saben por experiencia propia, porque están allí sentados en el medio de esos retos. Los países cuentan con un espacio fiscal acotado, con crecientes presiones para contener el gasto público, con miras a resguardar la dinámica de la deuda pública. Destacan en particular las presiones generadas por el alza en los pagos de intereses para el servicio de la deuda, particularmente aquellos vinculados con la deuda pública externa a consecuencia de las mayores tasas de interés internacionales. Este incremento ha llevado a una situación que en la CEPAL hemos caracterizado como de restricciones al desarrollo. Development distress es el término que usamos en inglés, en el que cuando los países tienen que dedicar 3, 4 y hasta 5...
When countries need to dedicate 3 to 4 GDP points to debt, it reduces the possibility of investing in social policies and health and other aspects of social economic development. We see a region that is stuck in 3 development traps. From 2014 to 2023, it grew 0.8% average, and this is less than half of the 2% growth that we saw in the last decade of the 80s. The challenge moving forward is whether we can avoid a third lost decade, but the idea is that it is urgent for countries to escalate their efforts and to use this toolbox to promote greater sustained development. Of course, raising investment rates, public and private. Unfortunately, as you well know, public investment has been a variable for adjustment in most countries in the fiscal realm, and this has serious consequences for growth. There's some synergistic issues between public and private investment, so the restriction of public investment also has an effect in reducing the private investment. The second trap is of inequality and low social mobility, and we see this as a result of 3 main things, and it's important to take a look at these I'm going to mention them briefly because we see that the solution for this pièce de résistance is, which we haven't really been able to reduce, is we need to work on all these elements simultaneously. It is important so that they can mutually reinforce themselves. So we see strong inequality and low mobility. But first, we see the existence of low productivity sectors. That is where we have a significant portion of unemployment, and with a high predomination of small and micro companies and self-employed persons that exist in a broad informal sector with low productivity and low income, therefore. So that is where we see this, and inequality is strongly linked to this productive matrix. This morning, the representative of Brazil said that this is one of the topics that Maria Concepcion Tavares was insisting on very much. And these social policies can somehow compensate for the people who work independently or in micro or small companies. But it is difficult to correct all these inequalities. So reduction of inequality has to do with productive development policies. Second, the deficiencies in professional training are key to promote social mobility together with dynamic markets, labor markets, gender equality, and I'm not going to delve into this. We have many diagnostics on this around reducing the gender inequalities in our countries, low dynamism in the creation of employment. We have some regressive tax aspects and social policies and the welfare state as weaknesses as well. So these are causes that could explain 80 to 85% of inequality, not everything, but there is vast literature and inequalities. But with this list of 5 or 6 players, we are capturing a very high percentage of the elements that explain inequality. So our recommendation is that it is important for the countries to have a comprehensive view of these causes and to act in a comprehensive manner. And we are putting these efforts at the core of these components. And then we have the third trap, which is low or inadequate governance, which characterizes many of our countries. We know that it's not enough to diagnose and to assess. We need to better understand the hows. We're working on, in ECLAC, we're working on improving governance of public policies, improving the top capacities of the prospective actions of institutions such as social dialogue, which is extremely important, part of the political capacities to address transitions and political economy of reforms and financing. These are all tools used for the necessary transformations. So the main challenge of countries in the region has to do with development such as advancing to build a more productive, inclusive, and sustainable future, managing the necessary transformations. And of course, how do we do this? With the new conditions of geoeconomics and geopolitics. Here at ECLAC, we insist that to obtain this highly sustainable society and to detach ourselves from these low growth traps, we should escalate the productive development. And this means working horizontally on the permits and the documentation traps, but also drivers and a more dynamic action. So we have a list of 14 of these that have a great effect: economic or energy transition, electromobility, circular economy, sustainable agriculture, water management, and sustainable agriculture. So this is all part of the green, this leap towards sustainability. And of course, we need modern services, the care economy, care society, and digital government, as well as the industrial sectors, pharmaceutical and medical devices. Finally, we recommend taking measures in attracting investment in order to take advantage of the onshoring tendency and everything that is happening in this new phase of globalization that characterizes the world. Of course, forming clusters, which can also be used to promote exports and increasing growth. So that is the partnership between the public and private worlds. In Spain, there are huge experiences in the Basque Country and in Catalonia, very successful, as well as throughout Europe. The clusters have 3,000 cluster initiatives that are in the databases. Now, we do this with the conviction that social and economic development does not happen spontaneously. It needs to be part of the result of good governance. And the way to do this is with the participation of all actors, all stakeholders, with adequate governance and collaboration, with adequate roadmaps. This does not happen spontaneously. It needs to be done adequately. It was highly criticized during the Washington Consensus, but part of what has happened is that with the financial crisis of the North Atlantic Treaty, as our friend Ocampo would say, we understood that the best financial sector was the unregulated or lightly regulated because and they saw that governments had to come to the rescue. And then the pandemic crisis and everything that took place thereafter led us all to reassess the key role of the state in these things. We shouldn't forget that. And it is important when we are thinking of productive actions. So some industrialized countries are working on these subsidies. Some countries don't have the resources or fiscal space for these policies. There are productive policies based on these elements with these cluster initiatives and collaborative ones. For more detail on the matter, there's a renewed vision here at ECLAC. I would like to invite you to read the special edition of ECLAC's magazine called Development of a More Sustainable Development, and you can see this in the most recent magazine of ECLAC celebrating the 75 years. And this development model needs to have a sustainability framework of public finances together with the expansion of fiscal space, increasing fiscal resources and making them effective by means of collection and their progressiveness so that they can contribute to resolve some of these aspects. We need to also perhaps modify the institutionality. It needs to better manage the economic cycle, allocate public resources, help growth, and of course, reduce evasion and illusion, which are of the essence. It's important in the next session to introduce the situation of or a fiscal panorama of Latin America and the Caribbean in 2024. And this will allow us to better understand these fiscal policy challenges in the region. We will also be hearing from several colleagues from the University of California in Berkeley and others. We will also, and we have also Gabriel Zuckman from Berkeley, and we will be hearing from other colleagues on the matter, analyzing the challenges of public expenditure to promote sustainable development, how to strengthen public resources, and how to expand the fiscal space and improve the debt sustainability.
Asimismo, tendremos
We also have the presentation that we prepared together with OECD and CIAT. Welcome once more, and I do hope you have a very fruitful fiscal policy seminar 2004. I'm sure of that. Thank you, Executive Secretary, for your words. I now hand over to Laura Oroz. She's Director of Cooperation with Latin America and the Caribbean, Spanish Agency for International Development. Thank you, sir, for your kind words. I also would like to thank ECLAC for the invitation to be here. I'd like to recognize the role of ECLAC and of all of the other institutions that have cooperated, ministers of finance, development banks, the Cooperation for Development, UN system, as well as all of the experts from the ministries in the region. This makes it all evident that in order to obtain results, we must have an institutional ecosystem that knows what are the challenges in fiscal policy and what is needed by the new world situation. As of the Spanish cooperation, we believe that we must support this cooperation by working now in creating collective intelligence space. This will bring in all of the stakeholders to foster this kind of debate. Let me bring in two elements. First, the promotion and our presidency to have further dialogue with this region. In one of the topics was how to face the green, digital, and social transition in a fair manner. Secondly, the Spanish commitment to celebrate the fourth forum for funding development in June 25. This all brings in a big challenge of gathering resources and trying to improve efficiency of collection in our countries, how to spend them well, and to reiterate that the public sector's responsibility in having greater fiscal capability, in creating more confidence of the citizens in institutions, and creating social cohesion with less inequality. We have been talking about what is needed to put this into action. I think that this morning we heard about the OECD studies on funding for transitions, and much of this has to do with some of the proposals. First of all, less regressive systems, taking up reforms that will bring in more collection without affecting consumption, investment, or growth, including other figures such as progressive taxation on high income sectors, environmental taxes that should be seen not just possible new collection, but also how to align economic incentives towards environmental sustainability, including tax on specific goods such as public health, following criteria to solve gender inequality. And here I will dwell a little more because it's so important for Spanish cooperation. Income tax, so as to increase more participation of women in the labor market and decreasing inequality in gender. And this requires, for example, benefits such as maternal leave and offsetting care expenses. People who are caring for others have more expenses. In terms of consumer taxes, we can mitigate the differences between men and women. Another would be the review of tax spending, adaptation of tax systems into digitalization of our economy. For example, strengthening digital taxes such as VAT, the fight against uh, tax evasion and avoidance, or following the international exchange of information. Lately, we have bet on a horizontal system with shared goals. We have just approved the program called Democracia. There we are searching for more reflection on fiscal pact, fiscal justice to promote the reduction of gaps, creating more confidence in institutions. We have partners such as OECD and Oxfam. And the idea is to encourage dialogue and exchange of information and mutual learning to promote analysis that will support specific policies, collaborating with international institutions to fight against fraud, and supporting local initiatives such as the fiscal platform for Latin America and the Caribbean. We do want this to be done together with our partners in the region so that we may more efficient in supporting public policies to improve global governance. And in talking about financial sustainability, we'd like to recover economic growth and the transformation towards a more inclusive, resilient societies. I'd like to congratulate ECLAC for the work well done, and I thank you all for being here in touch, and I hope we will all continue in touch with ASID. Thank you. Thank you for your words. And I now hand over to our moderator, Noel Perez Benitez, Head of Fiscal Affairs Unit from ECLAC. Thank you, Daniel. Let us immediately initiate the first session on panel of authorities of ministries of finance by fiscal policy challenges in the region. We'll have two presentations. First, we will hear from Gabriel Sukman, professor of economics, and he will be here on virtual means. Afterwards, Daniel Titelman will be bringing us the fiscal panorama of Latin America and the Caribbean. We have, by the way, copies outside available. And we will then have a round of presentations from the different finance ministries here with us. We have already connected, so we can now give the floor to Professor Gabriel Zugman from California and Berkeley.
Thank you. Thank you so much for inviting me today. Let me start by sharing my screen, and I trust that you can see the slides well. I wish I could be with you here in person today, but I'm nonetheless very happy to have the opportunity for this exchange. I'm Gabriel Zachman. I'm a professor at the Paris School of Economics and the University of California, Berkeley. I'm also the founding director of the EU Tax Observatory, which we are currently transforming into a truly global tax observatory. And I conduct research on the interplay between inequality and taxation. And so today I'd like to talk about the future of international tax cooperation. And I'd like to make the case that building on the successes of the last 10 years, the logical next step of international tax cooperation should involve a coordinated minimum tax on the very rich. And my starting point is that progressive taxation is a key pillar of democratic societies. A progressive tax system is critical to strengthen social cohesion and trust in governments. It is also critical to fund the public goods that are the true engines of economic growth: education, healthcare, public infrastructure. If you look at history over centuries, we know that's perhaps one of the most important lessons from economic history, that the key engine of economic growth is mass investment in education for all, in healthcare for all, and in good public infrastructure. And a progressive tax system is also essential to keep wealth concentration in check. There is a large body of work that shows how changes in the progressivity of taxation have been major drivers of the evolution of income and wealth inequality. Now, there is a growing realization that our tax systems, instead of being progressive, tend to be regressive, meaning that the rich pay a lower fraction of their income in taxes than other economic groups. This research is summarized in the Global Tax Evasion Report 2024 that our observatory released at the end of last year, and in which we try to take a comprehensive view of taxation, taking into account all taxes paid by the different economic groups. How do tax rates, effective tax rates, vary across the distribution of income? And a key finding that emerges from this body of work is that rich individuals tend to pay proportionately less than other groups. Now, let me illustrate that with some data for a number of Latin American countries. And this is building on work that was conducted by De Rosa, Flores, and Morgan. And that's published also on a website that I encourage you to visit, distribuciones.info, that contains the most up-to-date statistics on the distribution of wealth and income in Latin American countries, and also on tax progressivity, how effective tax rates vary across the distribution of income. I'm showing some results here. So these graphs, there's one graph for per country. On the x-axis, you have the different groups of the income distribution. P20, for instance, denotes the 20th percentile of the income distribution, the second decile. P30 is the third decile, and so on. And those studies go all the way up to the top 0.1% of the income distribution, P99.9. And on the y-axis, you have the effective tax rate paid by these different income groups when you take into account all the taxes that exist in the economy. So if you look at the case of Mexico, for instance, the first chart here, first of all, you can see that effective tax rates tend to fall with income. For instance, low-income earners have an effective tax rate that's higher than 20%, but the highest income earners have an effective tax rate that's only half of that, 10%. At the bottom of the distribution, consumption taxes, indirect taxes in gray on the graph, play a key role. At the top of the distribution, income taxes, personal income taxes, corporate income taxes are central. And it's not only in Mexico that the tax system is regressive. We see in other Latin American countries either a lack of progressivity, with all income groups paying more or less the same tax rates, or similar patterns in regressivity, for instance, here in Argentina, in Brazil, in Chile, and in a number of other countries. Again, I encourage you to visit this excellent website, distribuciones.info, that contains all these numbers. I should stress that those pictures underestimate the actual problem. The situation is even worse than what you can infer from those graphs, because one limitation of those graphs is that they end up in the top 0.1%. They do not try to look at what happens within that top group. This top group is very important because although it includes only 0.1% of the population, these are very rich individuals who account for a big fraction of income and a potentially large fraction of all tax revenues. Now, there's a body of work that tries to look at what happens within that top group, going all the way up to billionaires. Unfortunately, the studies here are limited to a number of high-income countries, so I don't have results to show yet for Latin America or Caribbean countries. But in those four relatively high-income countries in Europe and in the US that I show on this graph, there is a clear pattern that emerges. This graph also shows how effective tax rates vary across the distribution, again, including all taxes. On the x-axis, it's just like in the previous studies, except that those studies go way higher towards the top of the distribution, all the way up to billionaires. And what you can see on those charts is that billionaires tend to have particularly low tax rates, much lower in these four economies, the US, the Netherlands, France, and Italy, much lower than all other socioeconomic groups. Now, the reason for this regressivity, which is very striking, is that the very wealthy can easily structure their wealth such that this wealth will generate little or sometimes zero taxable income. Depending on the countries, this tax planning can involve the use of shell companies or holding companies or trusts or different legal structures, but the outcome is always the same. The income tax, which is normally the pillar of tax progressivity, fails to properly tax the individuals who have the highest ability to pay taxes, the super rich. Now, although there's a lot that can be done by countries acting unilaterally, what I want to stress is that the best way to address this problem of sharp regressivity, of billionaires having very low tax rates, is by creating a common minimum standard through international coordination. And why is international coordination so important? It's because in practice, the main obstacle to taxing the rich is the risk that they might move to relatively low tax places. This international tax competition has exerted considerable pressure on the design of tax systems globally. But with international coordination, we can put a binding floor to the tax rates of the ultra-wealthy. And what's very important to understand is that we now know that international coordination is possible because of the remarkable progress that's been achieved over the last decade. In 2021, more than 140 countries and territories agreed on a minimum tax for multinational companies with a minimum tax rate of 15%. And this idea that there could be nearly global agreements on minimum tax rates, this idea was deemed utopian 10 years ago. But now it's a reality. This minimum tax has started to be implemented in about 35 countries on January 1st of this year, and many other countries are going to soon join this system. So we now know that international tax competition is not some kind of law of nature, but that new forms of international cooperation can emerge in a relatively short period of time and make a real difference. Now, it's very important, and that's the main point that I wanted to convey today, to now apply that approach to the taxation of the very rich. We need an international agreement on a global minimum tax on super rich individuals. Such an agreement would be in the interest of all economic actors, even the taxpayers involved, to be honest, because what's at stake is not only the dynamic of global inequality, it is also the very sustainability of globalization from which the super rich benefit so much. Now, under the leadership of Brazil, that chairs the G20 this year, discussions have already started to create this new minimum tax on the super rich. And I want here to take a second to praise the incredible leadership of Brazil and of Minister Fernando Haddad on this very important issue. Now, let me talk a little bit about the one concrete proposal that I have formulated to implement in practice this idea. I was very honored to be invited in Sao Paulo at the end of February in a G20 finance ministers meeting to present a concrete embodiment for such a coordinated minimum tax on the super rich. So very concretely, let's say that billionaires, let's take global billionaires. Let's start with a population of very few, we're talking about 3,000 individuals, but very rich and very under-taxed individuals. Let's collectively agree that global billionaires should pay in tax each year the equivalent of at least 2% of their wealth. Some of these billionaires, sometimes it's quite rare, but it can happen, already pay a lot of tax. So for them, nothing would change. But many, many more pay almost zero today. And so they would have to pay an extra tax, let's say an extra income tax, such that their total tax payments would add up to at least 2% of their wealth. Now, if you try to simulate how much tax revenue such a tax could generate, the estimates that we have in the Global Tax Evasion Report 2024 suggest that with a rate of 2%, again, a very low rate, this minimum tax would generate around $250 billion in additional tax revenue globally. To put this number into perspective, the best available estimates suggest that developing countries need an additional $500 billion in tax revenue annually to deal with the challenges of climate change. So we can get half of that with just this modest but important minimum tax of 2% on global billionaires. Last week, I published an op-ed in the New York Times to explain this proposal, but there's going to be a lot more work, a lot of technical work to flesh out the details and hopefully convince as many countries as possible. I'm currently working on a technical report on the practicalities, the feasibility of such a tax, which will be published in June. Let me just say and conclude with this, that tax evasion is not a law of nature. Sometimes people think that trying to tax the super rich or multinational companies in a globalized world is doomed to fail because they will hide assets or they will move to low tax places and so on. And that's not true. Tax evasion is a policy choice. We can choose to tolerate it just like we can choose to fight it. We can choose coordination over competition. And indeed, there has been some very limited, but nonetheless real successes in terms of international cooperation over the last 10 years. I mentioned the minimum tax on multinational firms, which is really far from perfect, but which at least exists, and 15% is more than 0%. But there's also the automatic exchange of bank information as another example. Much more needs to be done, starting with the taxation of rich individuals. And of course, international coordination is always the ideal. But I also want to say that a lot can be achieved by countries acting unilaterally. We don't need to wait for all the world's countries to implement this minimum tax on the super rich. For individual countries or regions like Latin American and Caribbean countries to implement those policies by themselves. So I wanted to thank you for giving me the opportunity to give those remarks. And I welcome your leadership on this very important issue. Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you very much, Professor Zuckman. And now, y ahora continuamos con la presentación.
We now continue with Mr. Titelman, who is the Director of Economic Development Division at ECLAC. Thank you very much, Noel. Very well. We will now consider just one chapter of the Fiscal Panorama 24 that has to do with trends in public finances. It has three chapters. First, the trends of public finances in Latin America and the Caribbean. A second one that has to do with the carbon impact in the region and the macroeconomic implications of climate change and what could come about with a carbon tax in the region. And this is going to be seen in detail tomorrow. A third chapter looks at public spending and climate change in the region, starting from the database of functional spending. And this allows us to analyze in further depth. And the idea is to look at the structure in different sectorial components. And here, we are looking at the efforts in the region to look at public spending and the environment. I will focus on chapter number 1. As we already heard from the Executive Secretary, fiscal policy and fiscal situation in the region and in the world has been set by economic and regional happenings. Globally, even though we're talking about resiliency, we do hope that this year there will be a growth of 3.2 with high geopolitical uncertainties, but we're growing below the historic level globally. So the economy is resilient, yes, but we're watching relatively low growth rates comparing to the past, and that affects the global macroeconomy and the region as well. The trade volume for this year, we expect a growth of 2.6, which is contracts with a drop last year of minus 1.7, but we're still below the historic levels because of the geopolitical tension, and this also affects our fiscal situation and the possibility of our country to push ahead. We also heard, if we look at the middle, the sovereign bonds yield in dollars for some years and for some countries in the region and developed countries as well, we say that the financial costs are going up. This brings in difficulties for fiscal space. So we do have a global context that makes fiscal environment even more complicated. As we heard this morning at the PTCLA workshop, strengthening fiscal room and getting more fiscal funding in order to go forward to finance public services and goods is essential from a social standpoint and also for growth and the climate. So we are in difficult times, complicated times. The region doesn't have very positive macroeconomic news in order to be able to strengthen the fiscal space in the region. This is a graph often posted by ECLAC. I wanted to show you here how the region has lost impetus and growth. We're growing little. The average from 2014 up to 23 was 0.9%, and this is way below what was even called the lost decade and the debt crisis in the 80s. And Mr. Ocampo has already said that we had very many lost decades. And that is why I will continue. And this is very important when we go into fiscal analysis. And so we want to improve this level because there are challenges involved. And we'd like to support growth.
Since we have talked about the three development traps that challenge fiscal policy, the economic growth track, which is very volatile. We've just seen that, the trap of high inequality and low social cohesion, low social mobility that challenges fiscal policy, and the low institutional and governance capability that needs to mobilize fiscal policies in order to make progress, in order to face up to all the challenges. The point that we have made during several fiscal panoramas is that the major challenge in terms of how to adapt fiscal policy, and when I talk about fiscal policy, I speak about the fiscal space in order to face up to these challenges. And the major issue, as mentioned in the previous presentation, and as we have been insisting on, is how to strengthen public revenues capable of financing and increasing public expenditure in terms of investment and social expenditure, so that we can have a sustainable fiscal trajectory. So the main challenge is how to move towards the strengthening of fiscal spaces to strengthen public revenues, enabling an adaptation of the increasing demands for expenditure that our governments face within a context where these demands have to do with contributing to growth, contributing to the struggle against climate change, to begin to overcome social gaps and advance towards social inclusion. And that is the major challenge in a complex macroeconomic context that will remain in place and fairly complex over the next few years. Now, what is the snapshot of what is happening in Latin America in the fiscal sphere? Well, the first news, which is not very encouraging, is that public revenues have lost a trend of growth. 16 countries in Latin America. Tax revenues have dropped on average, and total revenues have also dropped between 19.2 and 18.6 percentage points of the GDP. Now, this drop is primarily the result of what happened in South America, where tax revenues dropped by practically 1% of the GDP between 2023 and 2024, and other revenues also diminished. And underlying this is the low rate of growth and the reduction of raw material prices, and that imply smaller taxes, also a slowdown in revenues in terms of income tax. And we find significant income tax drop in several countries of the region, and also a significant drop in less collection of VAT. And therefore, we are seeing a loss of the dynamism. And on top of that, we'll find another issue that was mentioned in previous presentations, which is tax evasion and tax avoidance within the region is a major problem in accordance with our estimations that we have just updated. When one looks at evasion in terms of income tax and And the VAT, the region is evading around 6.7% of the regional GDP. That represents almost $433 billion last year. And when we mention the needs for financing, we find that there is a lot of progress to be made there. And therefore, the issue of tax evasion and tax avoidance is one of the major challenges faced by the countries in the region in order to expand the fiscal space. The drop of tax revenues that we saw contrasts with a slight increase in public expenditure, primarily as a result of the payment of debt interests. For the average of Latin America, public expenditure in 2022 was 21.45, and this year it was at around 21.72, which reveals a slight increase. That slight increase is primarily the result of South America, whilst in Central America, Mexico, and the Dominican Republic, there is a very slight drop. And that increase in public expenditure that we are evidencing, as you can see on the graph on the right-hand side, despite the fact that all components have increased, and this is measured in percentage points of the GDP, the one that has increased most in terms of percentage points is 0.17% of the GDP is the payment of interests. And this refers to the increase of financial costs, which means, as we will show later on, that many countries, despite the fact that they face no indebtedness problem or are not close to a default or a debt crisis, the increase of the payment of the debt implies that they have to allocate far more resources to this than to other expenditure demanded by public expenditure policy. And within this context of a slight decrease of revenues and a slight increase of expenditure last year, we evidenced an increase of fiscal deficits and of public debt. On average in the region, we find that for Latin America, the total expenditure represented in the red line increased from 21.1 to 21.7% of the GDP, whilst revenues dropped from 18.2 to 18.6. And that means that we have moved from a surplus in 2022 of 0.3% of the GDP to a deficit of 0.4 percentage points of the GDP, and a global surplus, which includes the primary deficit plus a payment of interest of 2.2 to 3.1. And that is one of the issues that limits the ability and the challenge of expanding the fiscal space in the region. On the other hand, the public debt of the central government that was accelerated, as you can see in the graph, since 2010 onwards or 2012 onwards. It was undergoing an acceleration process, culminating in 2020 with 56% in terms of the GDP of the central government. After that, there was a slight reduction to 53% and 52%. And in 2023, again, we find an increase of the sovereign debt of central governments. And therefore, the issue of the debt as a hindrance to development and to the fiscal space is a key issue in our countries, together with the need to improve public revenues. On the other hand, in the Caribbean, public revenues also evidenced a slight drop, and accompanying this drop in public revenues, there was also a reduction of primary expenditure. Between 2022 and 2023, in terms of total revenues, changed from 26.9 to 26.8% of the GDP, and it moved from 20.4 to 20.1 last year. Now, this increase in terms of primary expenditure to reduce primary expenditure in the Caribbean, as you can see, was used for the payment of interests, primarily in Caribbean countries. And that has led to the fact that the strong reduction in expenditure, which is greater than the drop of revenues. That shows that Caribbean countries were able to generate a fiscal surplus last year of around 4% of the GDP in terms of primary surplus and a global deficit of minus 1.6, which is a difference which is the result of the payment of interests, and 0.3 compared to 2022. And the issue of the debt continues to be an important issue in the Caribbean, because despite the fact that it has, with an average in 2020 of 80% of the GDP, today it's practically 71% of the GDP on average. But there are countries, of course, that have a level of over 100%. There is a tremendous diversity there, but it continues to be a relevant aspect in terms of the fiscal space in the Caribbean, which is also increased as a result of the increase in financing costs that we have also evidenced. Now, ECLAC has already emphasized, and a document was issued that, as mentioned by the Executive Secretary, is called a development distress, in which we insist that the payment of interest reduces fiscal spaces significantly in the region when it comes to investment and social expenditure in our country. So this graph simply shows, in terms of percentage points of the GDP, the variability between 2022 and 2023. You can see that in practically all countries of the region, the payment of interests has increased in terms of percentage points of the GDP, in some cases 0.1 percentage points of the GDP, and in the case of Suriname, 2.2% of the GDP. The orange line is the payment of external interests. The light blue is domestic payments, and the purple bar, well, we have no information for that. It's ambiguous. But what is important is to show that in most countries, the payment of external interests is what explains the payment of interest. Brazil has a different situation because they have a very strong domestic debt in local currency. But for most countries, it is the payment of the foreign debt that is limiting the fiscal space to a very significant extent. Now, here we simply compare the payment of interest during 2012 and 2023 as percentage points of the GDP and as percentages of the tax revenues of the central government. And when you look, for example, at the average in Latin America in 2012, that was equivalent to practically 1.7% of the GDP, the payment of interest. And today, we are close to 2.7% of the GDP. In other words, it has increased a whole percentage point of the GDP when we face macroeconomic complexities and an increasing demand for public investment or public expenditure, and yet the payment of interest is capturing a larger proportion of that. And there is a variation. Brazil has practically 5.1% of the GDP in terms of the payment of interest, and Chile moved from 0.6 to 1.1. Colombia changed from 0.6. Costa Rica also varied. This basically responds to the situation in each country, but in general terms, all countries have increased their percentage of the GDP for the payment of interest. And when we compare that with the proportion of public revenues, we find that in 2012, that was equivalent to practically 11% of public revenues, and yet today that represents 17% of public revenues. In other words, a region that collects little because it has a very regressive taxation structure, and we're devoting an increasing amount of that collection to the payment of interests. That is a great challenge that our countries will face in order to strengthen and expand the fiscal space and to be able to finance the challenges of fiscal policy in a trajectory of fiscal sustainability. And therefore, the most important message that we want to convey is that the sustainable trajectory of fiscal expenditure is by increasing revenues rather than by reducing expenditure. That will have an increasingly and significant increase in our region. And that's all the initiatives mentioned by Professor Zucker with regards to the tax for the super rich. That is a key element when it comes to expanding public revenues. The larger amount of resources devoted to the payment of interest also implies a lower ability for social public expenditure and development distress measured in terms of production. On the left-hand side, you can see that in 2012, the payment of interest that was equivalent to around 47% of expenditure on education on average by our countries, is today close to 63%. Expenditure in health changed from 62 to 64. This is quite a high proportion, and the expenditure in social protection increased from 46 to 54%. In other words, what we are viewing is that the payment of interest is used up. The payment of interest uses up a large amount of the investments, and the investments are very high, practically 12 to 13% per year. We see that the payment of interest in last year was close to investment. Public investment by central governments totaled 1.7% of the GDP. So they're a significant 1% of the GDP, and that is basically the result of the payment of interests at the expense of financing foreign investment in a region that demands and requires an increase of investment to a very significant extent. Thus, in this chapter of the study, we discuss the ways to expand the fiscal space in order to face up to the increasing demand for more investment and expenditure. And we primarily focus on two issues in terms of revenues. We talk about the need to move towards strengthening information and supervision systems in order to reduce tax evasions, which is fundamental. We saw that around 433 billion, which could imply a significant amount of resources. That is what is represented by that. We also need to review and realign taxation, tax revenues. We make in our region a significant effort in terms of tax revenues, which varies between 3.7% of the GDP or 19% of the budgetary expenditure of central governments in 2021. 4% of the GDP, or practically 20% of these revenues are devoted to tax expenditure, tax incentives that we would have to review to analyze their effectiveness in terms of how they are operating. We also need to consolidate the tax to physical persons. When we compare Latin America with the OECD, on average in Latin America, direct taxation for income tax for physical purposes is around 2% of the GDP, and in the OECD, it's 8.3% of the GDP, which is the main difference between our region and the OECD. We also need the scope of taxes on property tax. And as José Ocampo mentioned this morning, this is a way of supplementing capital taxation or taxes on capital gains. We need to review the fiscal frameworks for the exploitation of non-renewable resources to make them more progressive. We feel that that is also an issue that will make the region make progress. And we also need to advance in terms of green taxes and taxes related to environmental and public health aspects. And finally, we need to adapt systems to the increasing digitalization of the economy. And there's a whole world of consumption of goods and services that is taking place within the digital realm, and we still don't know how to make progress in the taxation of that type of aspect beyond the taxation to the consumer, the VAT, but we need to apply taxes to the producer or the generator of services, because that also becomes very important.
Another thing that has been working very well in a positive fashion is innovation, investment, excuse me, and with the green bonds, social bonds, which normally have better conditions in terms of the financial cost and maturity of the bonds. That we believe is also important. And of course, these measures need to be accompanied by expenditure and fiscal institutionality. And the executive secretary mentioned that fiscal institutionality and, of course, the expenditure, improving the allocation of expenditures, which is ongoing. And those who have participated in the previous editions of the fiscal policy seminar understand that this has been mentioned earlier. But it's necessary to begin developing a strategic solution. So in order to improve the development dynamics, investment, we need to have a medium to long-term perspective in order to start to guide public expenditure and investments. We feel that there's an institutionality that we need to strengthen. I'd like to begin to conclude. There's fiscal policies that are sustainable are important, and the need to support innovation. That is one of the main challenges in the region. And here, what we do is we try to define these challenges that the executive secretary has put on the table. We need to advance and strengthen fiscal spaces. We have the challenge of advancing with social inclusion, social mobility, social cohesion, and to bridge the gap. And the development model, which requires enormous changes from the fiscal perspective. We also have the educational system, the educational blackout that we saw during COVID. We have high gender inequality, the economy care, which will require huge investments. So we have environmental development and climate change, which imply increasing the investment. So climate change equals investment. If we don't make an investment, it's not just about mitigation. We need to prevent. We have the digital gap. We have the idea of migrant flows, which are also very important. And to address these challenges of transformation and the development model, we need a sustainable development model that is strengthening the public income. So in sum, we have a worsening of macroeconomic conditions at a global and regional scale, which has affected the fiscal space of our region. The expansion of fiscal space is of the essence. It requires an effort to increase fiscal income and increase its progressiveness and reduce fiscal or tax evasion, and to contain the weight of the interest payment. We do have liquidity issues which affects the interest, and improving management and the quality of the expenditure, and of course mobilizing resources towards larger or greater transformations that are necessary to make growth more dynamic. Thank you.
Muchas gracias, Daniel, por esta.
Thank you, Daniel, for this interesting presentation, and Professor Schuckman for his presentation as well. We would now begin with the representatives of the ministries of finance of the region. We'll begin with the representative of Brazil. He's going to speak in Portuguese.